Today, we delve into the real origin of Columbus Day and dispel commonly held misconceptions most of us believe. While you likely know about the controversy of the myth, chances are you don't know about the true origin of the day. No worries, because you're in the right place, and by the end of our video, you'll have gained an entirely new perspective. So, let's dive in and see what actually lies beneath the surface. As we all know, Columbus Day has become an extremely polarizing holiday that tends to divide many Americans today. The controversy has in fact ignited protests throughout the US, with many states and cities choosing to replace it with a celebration of Indigenous Peoples' Day instead. Except, Columbus Day isn't really about what you likely think it's about. We've been taught it's about Christopher Columbus and his discovery of the New World. That's what we all remember from school, so it has to be true, isn't it? But what if I told you that the true origin of Columbus Day isn't really about Columbus himself at all? That it's really about the aftermath of an historic event, one that's been a largely forgotten part of our history. Do you know the real history of the origin of the holiday? A lot of historians get the myth correct, but they get the origin of the actual day wrong. Picture this. It's late 19th century, and it's the middle of the Industrial Revolution. It's a tumultuous time in our history, full of tension, of unrest and uncertainty, with the Civil War still weighing heavily on the hearts and minds of the people. This is the time period when Italians, particularly those from southern Italy, started coming over to America in significant numbers. Like many other ethnic groups that came before them, they came for opportunity, for adventure, and most importantly, they came for jobs, all of which were promised to them from ads that were prevalent throughout southern Italy at the time, ads that were enticing Italians with the promise of a better life. So, when southern Italians actually arrived in America, were they welcomed with open arms? Well, no, they weren't. They were instead seen as outsiders, and the newcomers were considered racially suspect. They weren't black, but they also weren't white, and because of this, they were largely unwelcome. It is true that the intolerance they suffered wasn't uncommon in this era. It's something that many that came before them had experienced as well. However, one event in particular brought this pre-existing animosity towards Italians to a boiling point. This particular event took place in the city of New Orleans on March 14, 1891, when thousands of enraged locals, grieving and distraught over the murder of their beloved chief of police, David Hennessy, gathered near the local jail. Hennessy had been killed the prior year, during the fall of 1890. The story goes that the very last person to see him alive said that the chief himself blamed the Dagos. Right before Chief Hennessy took his last dying breath. Dagos, as you probably already know, is a derogatory slur specifically used against Italians. The large crowds that gathered close by did so because several Italians had been recently acquitted, but were still in the jail. It didn't take much effort for organizers to fire up the already furious mob, numbering in the thousands, to action, resulting in the now livid mob, with only vengeance in their hearts, forcing their way into the jail. Actually, force is in reality much too strong a word. In truth, they met little to no resistance. Once inside the jail, the mob rounded up and mercilessly attacked any Italians they could find. By mercilessly, I mean savagely attacked, lynched, and even dismembered some of the Italians they murdered that day. I'll have to post a separate video about the New Orleans lynching specifically so I can cover the details and go over it more thoroughly. However, this video is more focused on the start of Columbus Day itself. By the way, this wasn't an isolated event in US history, and the anger towards Italians wasn't anything new. Italians, in particular Italians from southern Italy, weren't considered white and were targets well before this specific incident. Astonishingly, no one from the mob was ever held accountable. Not a single person, not even one. So if Columbus Day isn't about Columbus, then what's it truly about? It's about a forgotten chapter of history, a story of intolerance, violence, and political maneuvering. It's a reminder that sometimes the stories we're taught aren't always as we've been led to believe. The aftermath had unanticipated consequences for the US government. Italy's response to the New Orleans incident was swift. Incensed by the brutal lynching of their fellow countrymen, Italy formally demanded justice. Unfortunately, their calls for justice fell on deaf ears. Remember, that not a single member of the mob was ever held accountable for the mass lynchings. Now, this may come as a surprise, but at the time, Italy had one of the largest naval fleets in the world. They were truly a formidable force at sea, a fact that didn't escape the attention of the United States government. Decisively outmatched and outgunned at sea, the threat of war was very real and taken seriously. Ironically, even with the very real possibility of war, the mob's actions were actually praised throughout much of the US. In fact, there weren't many that were willing to publicly call out the heinous acts. Even a grand jury investigation officially pronounced the killings as praiseworthy. Historian Barbara Botein wrote the following regarding the investigation and the outcome, calling it possibly one of the greatest whitewashes in American history. The United States was caught in a precarious position. On one hand, they were faced with the wrath of a more powerful nation at sea, and on the other, there was public support for the mob's actions. Yes, you heard that right. In many parts of the US, people actually supported the mob's actions. With the possibility of war looming over the United States, something had to be done. The question was, what? What could possibly solve the looming crisis at sea and keep the American public happy at the very same time? The answer, as it turns out, lay in a small gesture that in reality threw justice to the wayside. In desperation to ease the tension, President Harrison proposed a solution. The president was caught between the rock of a potential war and the hard place of a disgruntled public. With a diplomatic crisis looming, the need for a resolution was urgent. To appease the Italian government and to mitigate the rising anti-Italian sentiment, President Harrison came up with a plan. He proposed a day of recognition for Cristoforo Colombo, an explorer born in Genoa, who would go on to become a patriotic symbol of Italian Americans. This was in fact the birth of Columbus Day, and the first national celebration of the day, which at the time was declared for a single day of celebration and not an annual event. The president believed that by honoring the Italian explorer, he could alleviate the tension with Italy and avoid backlash at home. The day was to be a celebration of the contributions of Italians to American culture and history. The decision was not without controversy, however. Those who supported the lynchings saw this as a capitulation to foreign pressure. They were outraged that the president would propose such a measure. This then culminated into a threat of impeachment of President Harrison himself, a testament to the deeply ingrained anti-Italian sentiment of the time. Yet, the establishment of Columbus Day, a single solitary day of celebration, wasn't a real solution. It actually didn't address any of the underlying issues. It didn't bring justice to the victims' families that the Italian government sought, nor did it hold the perpetrators accountable. It was, in essence, a lip service solution that provided no actual solutions. However, it served its intended purpose, which was to ease the diplomatic crisis and avert war. So, Columbus Day was actually born out of a need for diplomacy and not a celebration of discovery. Looking back, Columbus Day tells a story far different from what we've been led to believe. This day, often associated with the discovery of America by Colombo, or as we know him, Columbus, has roots that delve far deeper than most people are aware of. The real reason behind Columbus Day, contrary to common belief, is not about celebrating Columbus's discovery. Instead, it was conceived as a response to ease tensions with Italy following the infamous New Orleans incident in 1891. The true beginning of Columbus Day is one of tension, remembrance, and a quest for justice that was never realized. Interestingly, considering recent events, do you know who was against Columbus Day at the time, and the proposal to make it an annual holiday many years later? The Klan is the answer. At the time, they had a lot of influence in southern US states, and they absolutely didn't want Italians, who weren't considered white, to be celebrated. Don't forget, despite what some historians try and tell you, the evidence is overwhelming that Italians from southern Italy were definitely not considered white, or a shade of, as some people today would like you to believe. The New Orleans lynchings and Italy's response are what really inspired Columbus Day. This is what it was actually about. Columbus Day, and the romantic myth that was associated with it, was actually what helped Italian Americans become accepted in the US, which didn't fully happen until after the Civil Rights Movement. Remember that next time someone tells you it's a racist holiday, Share this story and video with them, because it's actually the racist, at the time, that were against the holiday, not the other way around. Let's not erase our past, but instead acknowledge it, learn from it, and strive for a future where justice is not a diplomatic bargaining chip, but a fundamental right for all. This story is a reminder that history is often more complex than we may believe, and it's up to us to seek the truth beneath the surface. What are your thoughts on celebrating Columbus Day? Should we eliminate the day altogether? Should we preserve it as is? Or should we change it in some way? Thank you for joining us to uncover the truth and gain new insight into the actual history. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.